Jacob Stone stood at the edge of Thunder Peak, his massive frame silhouetted against the crimson sunset, a Winchester rifle gripped in his weathered hands. Below him, the valley stretched like a battlefield, smoke rising from what had once been his home. Behind him, soft footsteps approached through the pine needles. He turned slowly, his steel-gray eyes meeting those of the woman they called Broken, the woman nobody believed could be saved. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then she stepped forward, and everything that had brought them to this moment hung in the balance between them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Colorado wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls, carrying with it the bite of early June mountain air and the scent of pine that never quite left the high country. Jacob Stone sat hunched over his kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey within arm's reach, though he hadn't touched it in hours. The amber liquid caught the dying light from the oil lamp, casting shadows that danced across his weathered face like ghosts of better times. At 6 feet 8 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, Jacob commanded attention wherever he went. But tonight, alone in the silence of his cabin, he felt smaller than he had since childhood. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like the mountain peaks that surrounded his ranch, crushing and inescapable. A floorboard creaked overhead, and Jacob's head lifted instinctively. Tommy was having another restless night. The boy had been plagued by nightmares, ever since the accident 18 months ago, ever since the rockslide that had claimed both his mother and baby brother in one terrible afternoon. Jacob had been working the far pasture when it happened, too distant to hear the rumbling stones, too far away to save the two people who had meant everything to him. He rose from his chair, his massive frame unfolding slowly, joints protesting after another day of back-breaking labor. The stairs groaned under his weight as he climbed to the small loft where his children slept. Tommy lay rigid in his narrow bed, his 8-year-old face pale and drawn, eyes wide open and staring at the wooden ceiling. "Another bad dream?" Jacob asked softly, his deep voice barely above a whisper. Tommy nodded but didn't speak. He hadn't said more than a handful of words since the day they buried his mother and little brother. The silence had settled over the boy like a shroud, and no amount of coaxing from Jacob or the well-meaning folks in town could draw him out of it. Across the small room, 6-year-old Lucy stirred in her bed, her golden hair tangled around her face. She had inherited her mother's delicate features and gentle disposition, but the spark that had once lit her blue eyes had dimmed considerably. She woke now, blinking sleepily at her father. "Papa?" she whispered, her voice thin and uncertain. "Is Tommy sick again?" Jacob moved to her bedside, his calloused hand smoothing her hair with surprising gentleness for such large fingers. "Just having trouble sleeping, little dove," he said, "like we all do sometimes." Lucy sat up, her small hand reaching for Tommy's across the space between their beds. Her brother's fingers were cold and trembling, and she held them as if her touch alone could chase away whatever demons haunted his dreams. "Mama used to sing when we couldn't sleep," Lucy said, her voice carrying a wistfulness that made Jacob's chest tighten. She knew all the pretty songs. Jacob's throat constricted. Rebecca had indeed known all the songs, all the stories, all the little comforts that made their humble cabin feel like a palace. She had been the heart of their home, the warmth that made even the coldest mountain winters bearable. Without her, the place felt like an empty shell, all function and no soul. "I'm not much of a singer," Jacob admitted, settling on the edge of Tommy's bed. The boy didn't pull away, but he didn't lean into his father's presence either. "But I can stay here until you fall asleep." Tommy's eyes finally focused on his father's face, and for a moment, Jacob saw a flicker of the bright, curious child his son had been before tragedy struck. Then it was gone, replaced by that distant, careful expression that had become too familiar. They sat in the quiet loft for nearly an hour, Jacob's presence a silent sentinel against the darkness. Eventually both children drifted back to sleep, their breathing evening out into the peaceful rhythm of the innocent. But Jacob remained, watching over them, tormented by his own inadequacy. When dawn finally broke over Thunder Peak, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Jacob was already dressed and moving through the morning routine that had become as automatic as breathing. Coffee first, black and strong enough to wake the dead. Then outside to check on the animals, repair whatever had broken overnight, and assess the endless list of tasks that running a ranch demanded. The Stone Ranch had been in his family for 2 generations, carved out of the wilderness by his grandfather, and expanded by his father into a respectable spread. But respectability required constant vigilance, and Jacob was falling behind. Fences sagged under the weight of winter snow damage. The barn roof leaked in 3 places. His small herd of cattle looked thin after a harsh winter and a spring that had been slower to arrive than usual. Standing on his porch with his coffee mug steaming in the crisp air, Jacob surveyed his domain with the critical eye of a man who understood that failure meant not just personal disappointment, but potential starvation for his children. The high meadows where his cattle grazed were still brown and patchy, struggling to green up in the unpredictable mountain climate. His nearest neighbor, Thomas Miller, had lost half his herd to wolves the previous winter, and the pack was still roaming somewhere in the nearby forests. Tommy emerged from the cabin, already dressed in his work clothes despite his young age. The boy had taken on responsibilities that would have challenged children twice his size, and he approached each task with a grim determination that both impressed and worried his father. Without speaking, Tommy headed for the chicken coop to gather eggs, his small frame moving with the efficiency of someone who had learned that work was both necessity and distraction. Lucy appeared next, her hair still tangled from sleep, struggling with the buttons on her dress. Jacob knelt to help her, his massive fingers fumbling with the tiny fastenings. Rebecca had always made it look so effortless, but everything about caring for his daughter felt clumsy and uncertain in his hands. "I'm hungry, Papa."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Lucy said, leaning against his broad chest as he worked. "My tummy makes growling sounds." Jacob's jaw tightened. Their food stores were running dangerously low, another reminder of how precarious their situation had become. He had been meaning to make the journey to Pine Ridge for supplies, but that meant leaving the children alone or bringing them along on the dangerous mountain roads. Neither option appealed to him. "We'll have breakfast in just a bit," he promised, though he wasn't entirely sure what that breakfast would consist of. "Tommy's getting eggs, and we've got some biscuits left from yesterday." The biscuits in question were hard as rocks and twice as appetizing, but they would have to suffice. Jacob had never mastered the art of cooking, despite months of trial and error that had produced more disasters than edible meals. Rebecca had been the one with the gift for turning simple ingredients into something that felt like love on a plate. After a meager breakfast eaten in the usual silence, Jacob made his decision. "We're going to town today," he announced, watching as both children looked up with expressions of surprise and something that might have been anxiety. "Need supplies, and it's been too long since we've been around other folks." Tommy's face immediately closed off, his eyes dropping to his plate. The boy had never been comfortable around strangers, and since the accident, he seemed to actively avoid any situation that might require him to speak or interact with others. Lucy, however, brightened slightly. "Will we see Mrs. Miller?" she asked hopefully. "She always smells like cinnamon and gives the best hugs." "Maybe," Jacob said, though he knew Sarah Miller would mother his children within an inch of their lives if given the chance. The woman meant well, but her constant fussing and worried glances made Jacob feel even more aware of his own failings as a parent. The journey to Pine Ridge took the better part of the morning, their wagon creaking and jolting over the rough mountain road that connected the scattered ranches to the small town nestled in the valley below. Jacob drove with one eye on the road and another on the surrounding forest, his rifle within easy reach. These mountains held dangers beyond wolves and bears, though those were concerning enough. Pine Ridge was barely more than a wide spot in the road, but it represented civilization in a land that could be unforgivingly wild. The main street boasted a general store, a saloon, a small church with a bell tower that could be heard for miles, and the sheriff's office that served a territory larger than some eastern states. Perhaps 24 families called the town home, with another 50 or so scattered across the surrounding ranches and mining claims. Jacob tied their wagon outside the general store, helping Lucy down while Tommy scrambled over the side with the independence that had become his trademark. The boy's silence drew curious glances from the few townspeople moving about their morning business, but most folks in Pine Ridge had learned not to pry too deeply into their neighbors' affairs. Inside the store, proprietor Edmund Walsh greeted them with the hearty familiarity of a man who understood that customer relationships were built over years, not transactions. "Jacob, good to see you," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Been wondering when you'd make it down from the mountain." "Supplies running low," Jacob replied, scanning the shelves that held everything from canned goods to farming implements. "Need to stock up before the summer gets too busy." Walsh nodded, but his expression grew concerned as he tallied the items Jacob selected. When they reached the counter to settle accounts, the storekeeper cleared his throat awkwardly. "Jacob, your credit's stretched about as far as I can allow," he said quietly, mindful of the children nearby. "I know times have been hard since Rebecca passed, but I've got my own bills to consider." Heat rose in Jacob's neck, the shame of financial embarrassment mixing with the frustration of a man who had always paid his debts. "How much do I owe?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would be more than he had. $47 and change, Walsh said apologetically. "I'm not trying to be hard-hearted, but the bank's been asking questions about the accounts I carry." Jacob stared at the meager pile of supplies on the counter, calculating rapidly in his head. He had perhaps $12 in his pocket, money that had taken him months to scrape together from selling a few head of cattle. It wasn't nearly enough. "I understand," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "What can $12 buy?" They settled on a reduced selection of absolute necessities, enough to keep them fed for perhaps 2 weeks if they were careful. As Walsh wrapped their purchases, Lucy tugged on Jacob's coat sleeve. "Papa, why did we put the sugar back?" she asked innocently. "I like sugar in my oatmeal." Jacob knelt to her level, his heart breaking at the simple request he couldn't fulfill. "We don't need sugar today, little dove," he said gently. "Maybe next time." As they prepared to leave, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the store's front window, Jacob could see a crowd gathering near the church, voices raised in what sounded like heated discussion. Walsh craned his neck to see, his expression shifting to one of distaste. "Auction day," he explained grimly. "Though I never much liked the idea of it myself." Jacob's curiosity was piqued despite his eagerness to leave town. "What kind of auction?" Walsh hesitated, glancing meaningfully at the children. "The kind that decent folks shouldn't have to witness," he said carefully. "But times are hard, and people do what they must to survive." Despite his better judgment, Jacob found himself drawn toward the crowd, Tommy and Lucy trailing behind him. The gathering was centered around a small platform that had been erected near the church steps, where Sheriff Hayes stood with an uncomfortable expression. Next to him, a well-dressed man Jacob didn't recognize, was consulting a sheaf of papers while speaking in the measured tones of someone accustomed to conducting business. "What we have here," the stranger was saying, "is a woman of working age, strong constitution and proven domestic capabilities. She's been living rough for some time, but nothing that proper care and guidance can't remedy." Jacob's blood chilled as he realized what he was witnessing. He had heard of such things, but had never imagined he would see them in a place like Pine Ridge. The crowd murmured among themselves, some with obvious interest, others with expressions of moral discomfort. Then she appeared, led from behind the platform by 2 men who looked more like guards than escorts. Even from a distance, Jacob could see that she was tall for a woman, perhaps 5.5 feet, with dark hair that hung in unkempt waves around a face that might have been beautiful under better circumstances. Her dress was little more than rags, patched and repatched until it was more repair than original fabric, but it was her posture that caught Jacob's attention. Despite her obvious circumstances, she held herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength. Her chin was raised, her shoulders straight, and though her hands were bound before her, she faced the crowd with eyes that held no pleading, no shame, only a careful assessment of the faces before her. "Bidding starts at $5, the auctioneer called out. "For a woman who can cook, clean and work a homestead, strong as any man when it comes to labor, but with the feminine touch that makes a house a home." Several men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, but a few raised their hands. Jacob recognized most of them, and the recognition made his stomach turn. These were not men looking for household help or honest companionship. These were men with appetites that decent women wouldn't satisfy, and moral standards that wouldn't trouble them in the dark. $7, called out Pete Morrison, a rancher whose reputation with women was widely known and universally condemned. $8, countered his neighbor, a man whose wife had died the previous winter, and whose farm had since descended into squalor. Jacob found himself studying the woman more closely. There was something about her that nagged at his consciousness, a quality he couldn't quite identify. She seemed familiar somehow, though he was certain they had never met. Her eyes swept the crowd, pausing briefly on each face before moving on, as if she were memorizing them for some future accounting. $10, Morrison called out again, his voice taking on an ugly edge. "And I'll take good care of her, don't you worry about that." A few men in the crowd chuckled at the obvious implication, while others looked away in disgust. Jacob felt Lucy's small hand slip into his, and he realized his daughter had moved closer to him, perhaps sensing the tension in the air even if she didn't understand its source. The woman's gaze found Jacob then, and for a moment their eyes locked across the distance. He saw intelligence there, and pain, and something else that took him a moment to recognize as hope. Not hope for rescue, exactly, but hope that perhaps not every man in the crowd was cut from the same cloth as those who were bidding on her like livestock. $15, called out another voice, and Jacob turned to see Doc Patterson stepping forward. The elderly physician's face was grim with disapproval, but his intention was clear. He was bidding not from desire, but from conscience, trying to save the woman from a worse fate. 20, Morrison countered immediately, his jaw set with determination. It was clear he wouldn't be outbid easily. Jacob felt something stirring in his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced in months. It might have been anger at the injustice of what he was witnessing, or protectiveness towards someone who clearly needed an advocate. He thought of Rebecca, of how she would have reacted to seeing another woman treated like property, and he knew with sudden clarity what he had to do. $25, he heard himself say, his deep voice carrying easily across the crowd. Heads turned toward him, surprise evident on many faces. Jacob Stone was known as a quiet man, someone who kept to himself and his family, not given to dramatic gestures or public displays. But here he was, stepping into a situation that most decent folks were trying to ignore. Morrison's face darkened with irritation. 30, he spat, glaring at Jacob with obvious hostility. Jacob met his gaze steadily, his own expression calm but implacable. He thought of his children, of their need for stability and care that he was failing to provide. He thought of his empty cabin and cold meals, and the silence that had settled over their lives like a burial shroud. And he thought of the woman on the platform, holding herself with dignity despite being reduced to an object for sale. $50, he said quietly. The crowd fell silent, sensing that the bidding had moved beyond simple commerce into something more personal. Morrison's face cycled through several expressions before settling on frustrated defeat. $50 was more than most men in Pine Ridge saw in 2 months of hard work. The auctioneer looked around hopefully for any other bids, but the crowd remained silent. Sold, he called out finally, to Jacob Stone for $50. As Jacob stepped forward to complete the transaction, he was dimly aware of the murmurs following him, some approving, some scandalized, all surprised by this unexpected development. He handed over money he couldn't afford to lose, receiving in return a receipt and a brief lecture about his new responsibilities under territorial law. When the woman was brought down from the platform, Jacob found himself face to face with her for the first time. Up close he could see that she was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps in her late 20s, with gray-green eyes that seemed to look right through him. Her features were sharp with hunger and exposure to the elements, but there was an underlying beauty that spoke of better times. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, conscious of the crowd still watching their interaction. She hesitated for a moment, as if the question required careful consideration. "Clara," she said finally, her voice hoarse from disuse but carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. "Clara Bennett," Jacob nodded, accepting the introduction without pressing for more details. There would be time for questions later, away from the curious eyes and wagging tongues of Pine Ridge. For now he simply gestured toward his wagon. "Can you walk?" he asked, noting the way she favored her left foot. Clara's chin lifted slightly, pride evident in her posture. "I can walk," she said firmly. "I can work too if that's what you're expecting. Right now I'm expecting we should get away from here," Jacob replied, glancing meaningfully at the crowd that showed no signs of dispersing. "My children are getting restless, and it's a long ride back to the ranch." As they walked toward the wagon, Lucy looked up at Clara with wide, curious eyes. "Are you coming home with us?" she asked innocently. Clara's step faltered slightly, and Jacob saw something flicker across her face. "If your father wants me to," she said carefully. Tommy, who had remained silent throughout the entire proceedings, suddenly stepped closer to Jacob's side. His small hand tugged at his father's coat, and when Jacob looked down, the boy's eyes were wide with something that might have been worry or confusion. "It's all right, son," Jacob said gently, resting his hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Miss Clara is going to help us for a while." As they reached the wagon, Jacob realized he had just committed to something he didn't fully understand. He had spent $50 he didn't have on a woman he didn't know, motivated by impulses he couldn't entirely explain. But as he helped Clara into the wagon bed, mindful of her obvious exhaustion and the chains that still bound her wrists, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: purpose. For the first time since Rebecca's death, he had taken action that felt meaningful, that connected him to something larger than his own grief and failure. Whether that action would prove wise or foolish remained to be seen, but it was movement forward instead of the endless circling of guilt and inadequacy that had defined his recent existence. As they pulled away from Pine Ridge, Jacob caught Clara's reflection in the wagon's side mirror. She was looking back at the town with an expression he couldn't read, her bound hands clenched in her lap. Whatever had brought her to that auction platform, whatever circumstances had reduced her to being sold like livestock, those stories would emerge in time. For now it was enough that she was free of Morrison's leering gaze, and heading towards something that might, with effort and luck, prove better than what she was leaving behind. The road home stretched before them, winding up into the mountains where Thunder Peak stood sentinel over the valley. Behind them Pine Ridge grew smaller until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vastness of the Colorado high country. And in the wagon bed, Clara Bennett sat quietly, her gray-green eyes fixed on the horizon ahead, perhaps wondering what new chapter of her story was about to begin. Part 2. The Chains Fall Away. The wagon wheels creaked in steady rhythm as they climbed the winding mountain road, each turn revealing new vistas of pine-covered slopes and granite peaks that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky. Jacob kept his eyes on the treacherous path ahead, but his awareness was divided between managing the horses and the quiet presence of the woman sitting behind him. Clara Bennett had not spoken since they left Pine Ridge, though Jacob caught glimpses of her in his peripheral vision. She sat straight back despite her obvious exhaustion, her bound hands resting in her lap, her gaze moving constantly between the surrounding forest and the children who shared the wagon bed with her. Lucy had overcome her initial shyness, and was chattering softly about everything she saw, pointing out wild flowers and rock formations with the enthusiasm only a 6-year-old could muster. Tommy remained silent as always, but Jacob noticed his son stealing curious glances at their unexpected passenger when he thought no one was looking. As they reached a relatively level stretch of road, Jacob pulled the horses to a halt and set the brake. The sudden stop caused Clara to tense, her body shifting as if preparing to run or fight, though with her hands bound such preparations would be futile. "Easy," Jacob said quietly, climbing down from the driver's seat. "Just thought we should take care of something that should have been handled back in town." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folding knife, its worn handle speaking of years of faithful service. Clara's eyes fixed on the blade, and Jacob saw her swallow hard, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm going to cut those ropes," he said, moving slowly and deliberately, so as not to startle her. "Can't have you riding all the way to the ranch trussed up like a Christmas goose." Clara extended her hands hesitantly, as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. The ropes had been tied tight enough to leave angry red marks on her wrists, and Jacob felt a flash of anger at whoever had bound her so cruelly. "This might sting a bit," he warned, working the knife carefully between the ropes and her skin. "Circulation's been cut off for too long." The moment the ropes fell away, Clara's hands flew to her wrists, rubbing the damaged skin with tears springing to her eyes. Not tears of pain, Jacob realized, but of relief so profound it overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the mountain wind. Jacob nodded and returned the knife to his pocket. "Should have been done the moment they handed you over," he said. "Some things aren't right, no matter what the law says." Lucy had been watching this exchange with fascination, and now she scooted closer to Clara, her small face filled with concern. "Does it hurt very much?" she asked, reaching out as if she wanted to touch the rope burns but didn't quite dare. Clara looked down at the little girl, and for the first time since Jacob had seen her, her expression softened completely. "It's much better now," she said gently. "Your father has very kind hands." The comment made Jacob unexpectedly uncomfortable, and he busied himself checking the horses' harnesses to avoid meeting Clara's eyes. He wasn't accustomed to being seen as kind, particularly not by women who had every reason to be wary of men and their motivations. "We should keep moving," he said gruffly. "Still got a few hours of daylight, but these mountain roads can be treacherous after dark." As they resumed their journey, Jacob found himself stealing glances back at Clara through the wagon's side mirror. She was flexing her fingers and rotating her wrists, working feeling back into hands that had been numb for who knew how long. There was something almost ritualistic about the movements, as if she were reclaiming ownership of her own body. The road grew steeper as they climbed higher into the mountains, forcing the horses to work harder and slowing their progress considerably. Jacob had made this journey hundreds of times, but today he found himself seeing it through fresh eyes, imagining how it must appear to someone encountering the Colorado high country for the first time. The landscape was both beautiful and intimidating, with towering peaks that seemed to dwarf human ambition and forests so dense they appeared almost black in the shadows. This was country that demanded respect, that could kill the unprepared or unlucky without malice or mercy. It was also country that could heal a person's soul if they were strong enough to earn its acceptance. "Where are you from originally?" Jacob asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over them. Clara was quiet for so long he began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of caution, as if she were testing the words before fully committing to them. "Kansas," she said. "A farm outside Topeka. Seems like a lifetime ago now." "Long way from Kansas," Jacob observed. "What brought you to Colorado?" Again, that long pause filled with consideration and what might have been calculation. "Circumstances," Clara said finally. "Sometimes a person has to leave everything behind and start over somewhere new." Jacob heard the finality in her tone, and recognized it as a boundary she wasn't ready to cross. He had his own secrets, his own painful memories he preferred not to share with strangers, so he could respect her need for privacy. "These mountains have a way of giving folks a fresh start," he said instead, "if they're willing to work for it." Lucy, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange, suddenly perked up with a question that cut straight to the heart of things with the devastating honesty only children possessed. "Are you going to be our new mama?" she asked Clara, her blue eyes wide with hope and uncertainty. The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, impossible to ignore, and surprisingly difficult to dispel. Jacob felt heat rise in his neck, embarrassed by his daughter's directness, but also curious about how Clara would respond. Clara's face cycled through several expressions before settling on something gentle but honest.
"I'm here to help your father with the ranch work," she said carefully. "To cook and clean and do whatever needs doing. Your mama was a very special lady, and no one could ever take her place." Lucy considered this answer with the seriousness of a child processing complex adult emotions. "Papa says Mama is with the angels now," she said. "But angels can't make biscuits or braid hair or sing lullabies." Clara's eyes found Jacob's in the mirror, and he saw understanding pass between them. This little girl was hungry for maternal comfort, for the feminine presence that had been absent from her life for too long. It was a need that couldn't be filled by even the most devoted father. "I can braid hair," Clara said softly. "And I know a few lullabies, though I'm not sure how well I remember them." Lucy's face lit up like sunrise over the mountains. "Really? Papa tries to do my hair, but his fingers are too big and he always gets the tangles worse." Jacob felt a familiar stab of inadequacy at his daughter's innocent observation. There were so many things Rebecca had made look effortless, that he struggled with daily. Simple domestic tasks that seemed to require some mysterious feminine intuition he would never possess. "I expect Miss Clara knows about such things," he said, grateful for any help with the countless challenges of raising a daughter. Tommy, who had been listening to this conversation in his characteristic silence, suddenly spoke up. His voice was rusty from disuse, barely above a whisper, but clear enough to stop all other conversation. "Can you ride horses?" he asked Clara, his eyes fixed on her face with unusual intensity. Clara blinked in surprise, clearly not having expected the quiet boy to address her directly. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I learned when I was about your age. My father said everyone in Kansas needed to know how to handle horses." Tommy nodded solemnly, as if this information confirmed something important in his young mind. "Mama couldn't ride," he said, the first mention of his mother Jacob had heard him make in months. "She was scared of them, said they were too big and unpredictable." The admission hung in the air, profound in its simplicity. Rebecca had indeed been nervous around horses, preferring to leave their care entirely to Jacob. It had been one of the few areas where her competence hadn't extended, and Tommy had clearly noticed. Some people are naturally comfortable with horses, and others have to work at it, Clara said diplomatically. Both ways are perfectly fine. Animals can sense when someone is nervous, so it's better to be honest about your feelings than to pretend otherwise. Jacob was struck by the wisdom in her response, the way she had acknowledged Tommy's observation without criticizing his mother or making the boy feel foolish for mentioning it. It suggested experience with children, or at least an intuitive understanding of how their minds worked. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation gradually became more natural, less stilted with mutual wariness. Clara asked thoughtful questions about the ranch, the country, the challenges of mountain life. Jacob found himself explaining things he usually took for granted, seeing his world through the eyes of someone encountering it for the first time. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when they finally reached the turnoff to the stone ranch. The wooden sign marking the property boundary was weathered and slightly askew, another item on Jacob's endless list of repairs that never seemed to get completed. "There," he said, pointing toward a cluster of buildings nestled in a natural meadow. Clara studied the ranch with the same careful attention she had given everything else, her eyes taking in the main cabin, the barn, the various outbuildings, and the fenced pastures where Jacob's small herd of cattle grazed. It was a modest operation by any standard, but it represented everything Jacob had worked for, everything he hoped to pass on to his children. "It's beautiful," Clara said, and Jacob was surprised to hear genuine appreciation in her voice. "Peaceful. Peaceful when the wolves aren't trying to get at the cattle," Jacob said dryly, "or when the roof isn't leaking, or the fences aren't falling down, or any of a dozen other things that seem to break faster than I can fix them." Clara nodded, as if she understood the challenges of maintaining a ranch in difficult country. "It takes time to build something that lasts," she said, "and it usually takes more than one person to do it right." As they pulled into the yard, Tommy and Lucy began pointing out various features of their home to Clara. The chicken coop where Lucy was responsible for gathering eggs. The woodpile where Tommy split kindling with an axe that was almost too big for him to handle safely. The garden plot that had been Rebecca's pride and joy, now overgrown with weeds and neglect. Jacob saw Clara's eyes linger on the garden, taking in the obvious signs of abandonment. Wild grass and volunteer plants had invaded what had once been neat rows of vegetables and herbs. A few hardy perennials struggled to maintain themselves, but most of Rebecca's carefully tended plants had succumbed to neglect. "The garden could be beautiful again," Clara said quietly. "With some work and attention." "Mama loved her garden," Lucy said wistfully. "She grew the biggest tomatoes in the whole valley, and flowers that smelled like heaven." Jacob felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever his wife's memory surfaced unexpectedly. He had avoided the garden for months, unable to bear the reminder of everything he had lost, everything he was failing to maintain. "Maybe," he said non-committally, climbing down from the wagon, "right now we need to focus on getting settled before dark." As he began unloading their meager supplies from town, Clara climbed down from the wagon bed with careful dignity. She stood for a moment in the ranch yard, turning slowly to take in her surroundings with the thoroughness of someone who understood that details mattered. "The barn first," Jacob said, interpreting her survey as practical assessment. "We'll get you set up with a place to sleep, then see about supper." Clara's expression shifted slightly, and Jacob realized she might have interpreted his words as relegating her to sleeping with the animals. The thought hadn't occurred to him, but he could see how a woman who had just been sold at auction might assume the worst about her accommodations. "There's a room in the back of the barn," he clarified quickly, "built it for hired hands during roundup season. It's small, but it's clean and warm, with a proper bed and washstand." Relief flickered across Clara's features, quickly masked but unmistakable. "That sounds very satisfactory," she said formally. "I appreciate your consideration." The room in question was indeed small, perhaps 8 feet by 10, with a single window that looked out toward the mountains. Jacob had built it himself 3 years earlier, thinking he might eventually hire additional help during the busiest times of the ranch calendar. The bed was narrow but sturdy, covered with quilts Rebecca had made, and there was a washstand with a cracked mirror, and a small chest for storing personal belongings. "It's not much," Jacob said, setting Clara's few possessions down on the chest, "but it's private, and you'll be warm enough." Clara moved to the window, looking out at the view of Thunder Peak rising majestically against the evening sky. "It's perfect," she said, and Jacob was surprised to hear genuine contentment in her voice. "I haven't had a room of my own in longer than I care to remember." There was a story in that statement. Jacob realized a history of circumstances that had led to her being sold at auction in Pine Ridge, but pressing for details seemed both intrusive and unkind, so he simply nodded and turned toward the door. "Supper will be ready in about an hour," he said. "Nothing fancy, but you're welcome to join us at the table." Clara turned from the window, and for a moment her careful composure slipped, revealing something vulnerable underneath. "You mean eat with the family?" she asked. "Not separately." The question revealed more about her recent experiences than Jacob was comfortable knowing. "Of course with the family," he said gruffly. "What kind of man do you think I am?" "A good one," Clara said simply, and the words carried a weight that suggested she had encountered plenty of the other kind. Part 3. Skills revealed. Dawn came early in the high country, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold that made even the most jaded observer catch their breath in wonder. Jacob was already dressed and moving through his morning routine when he heard sounds from the kitchen that made him freeze in surprise. Someone was cooking breakfast. He had left Clara in the barn room the previous evening, after a simple supper of beans and hardtack, assuming she would sleep late after what had obviously been a difficult period in her life. Instead, he found her at his stove, efficiently managing what appeared to be a full breakfast with ingredients he was certain hadn't been in his pantry the night before. "Good morning," Clara said without turning around, as if she had sensed his presence in the doorway. "I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty of starting breakfast. I found some things in your pantry that were getting close to spoiling, and it seemed a shame to waste them." Jacob looked around his kitchen in amazement. In the space of perhaps an hour, Clara had transformed the usually chaotic space into something that resembled the organized domain Rebecca had once maintained. Dishes were clean and stacked neatly. The stove was properly tended, with multiple pots and pans working in harmony, and the smells filling the air were nothing short of miraculous. "Where did you find bacon?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "I know I didn't buy any yesterday." Clara smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of amusement he had seen from her. "You had a slab of salt pork wrapped in cloth at the back of your pantry. It was starting to develop a skin, but the meat underneath was still perfectly good. A little soaking and proper preparation can work wonders." As if summoned by the heavenly aromas, Tommy and Lucy appeared in the kitchen doorway, their eyes wide with wonder. Lucy clapped her hands together in delight, while Tommy's usual solemn expression softened into something approaching happiness. "It smells like Mama's kitchen used to," Lucy breathed, and Jacob felt his chest tighten at the innocent observation. "Different from your mama's cooking, I'm sure," Clara said gently, "but I hope you'll find it satisfactory." She began plating the food with the efficiency of someone accustomed to feeding multiple people: eggs scrambled to perfection, bacon that was crispy without being burned, and what appeared to be actual biscuits, golden brown and steaming hot. "How?" Jacob asked, staring at the biscuits in particular. He had tried numerous times to recreate Rebecca's recipe, with results that ranged from edible to catastrophic, but never approaching anything resembling success. "Flour, lard, buttermilk and salt," Clara said simply. "The trick is not to overwork the dough, and to have the oven at the right temperature. Your wife's recipe box was very helpful." Jacob realized she must have found Rebecca's collection of handwritten recipes, something he had packed away months ago because seeing his wife's careful handwriting had been too painful. The thought of Clara reading through those intimate domestic notes stirred up complicated emotions he wasn't prepared to examine. "I hope that was all right," Clara added, perhaps sensing his discomfort. "I didn't mean to presume, but I wanted to make something the children would enjoy." "It's fine," Jacob said quickly, though his voice came out rougher than intended. "It's good, very good." They ate in relative silence, but it was a different quality of quiet than the oppressive hush that had characterized most of their meals since Rebecca's death. This was the comfortable stillness of people enjoying good food in each other's company, broken occasionally by Lucy's expressions of delight, or Tommy's rare requests for seconds. After breakfast, Clara began clearing the table with the same quiet efficiency she had shown in cooking. Jacob started to help, but she waved him away with a gesture that was somehow both respectful and authoritative. "You have ranch work to do," she said. "This is what I'm here for." Jacob hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of leaving all the domestic work to Clara while he went about his usual tasks. It felt too much like the arrangement she had been sold into, too reminiscent of the auction block and the implications of ownership. "We're partners in this," he said carefully. "Not master and servant. You do what needs doing, and so do I." Clara paused in her dishwashing, her hands still in the soapy water, and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Partners," she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. "Partners," Jacob confirmed. "Everyone contributes what they can, everyone benefits from the results." Something shifted in Clara's posture, a subtle relaxation that suggested she had been braced for a different kind of relationship entirely. "In that case," she said, "I have some suggestions about the ranch that might be helpful, such as—" Clara dried her hands on her apron, and moved to the kitchen window, which offered a clear view of the ranch yard and surrounding pastures. "Your cattle look thin," she said without preamble, "and they're bunched up in the lower pasture when they should be spread out for better grazing." Jacob joined her at the window, seeing his small herd through her eyes. She was right, of course. The animals did look underfed, and they were indeed clustered together in a way that suggested either poor management or some external threat keeping them from ranging more freely. "The wolves have been active," he admitted. "Cattle bunch up when they're nervous. Wolves are a problem that can be solved," Clara said matter-of-factly, "but not if you're trying to handle everything yourself. You need help with the herding, with the night watches, with the basic maintenance that keeps a ranch running." Her assessment was accurate, and delivered without judgment, but it still stung Jacob's pride to hear his failures catalogued so efficiently by someone who had been on his property for less than 24 hours. "I manage," he said defensively. "You survive," Clara corrected gently. "There's a difference. Managing means thriving, growing, building something sustainable. Surviving means just hanging on until the next crisis hits." The distinction was uncomfortable in its accuracy, but before Jacob could formulate a response, Tommy appeared at his elbow with the kind of urgent intensity that usually preceded important announcements. "Miss Clara," the boy said, his voice still soft but clear, "can you really ride horses like you said yesterday?" Clara looked down at him with patient attention. "Yes, I can. Why do you ask?" Tommy glanced at his father, then back at Clara, as if weighing the wisdom of his next words. "Papa needs help with the cattle," he said simply, "but he won't hire anyone because we don't have money for wages." The brutal honesty of his son's observation hit Jacob like a physical blow. Tommy had clearly been paying attention to their financial struggles, understanding far more about their precarious situation than an 8-year-old should have to contemplate. "Tommy," Jacob began, but Clara held up a hand to stop him. "That's a very practical observation," she said to the boy, "and you're right that ranch work is easier with multiple people. Would you like to show me your horses? I'd enjoy meeting them." Tommy's face lit up with an enthusiasm Jacob hadn't seen in months. "Yes, ma'am, we have 4 horses, but Blaze is the best. He's smart and fast and he never gets spooked by anything." As Tommy led Clara toward the corral, chattering excitedly about each horse's personality and abilities, Jacob found himself following behind like a spectator to his own life. He watched Clara examine each animal with the confidence of someone who genuinely understood horses, running practiced hands over their legs and backs, checking their hooves and teeth with professional thoroughness. "This one has excellent conformation," she said, stroking the neck of Blaze, a chestnut gelding that had been Jacob's primary riding horse for years. "Good bone structure, intelligent eyes. You've trained him well." "Blaze was Papa's horse before he was mine," Tommy said proudly. "Papa says he's the smartest horse in the whole valley." Clara smiled at the boy's obvious affection for the animal. "I can see why. He has the look of a horse that thinks before he acts." She turned to Jacob. "Would you mind if I took him out for a short ride? I'd like to get a feel for your grazing areas, see what you're working with." Jacob found himself nodding agreement before he had fully considered the implications. Watching Clara handle the horses, seeing the easy competence with which she moved among them, he was beginning to understand that she possessed skills he desperately needed. "Take the North Trail," he suggested. "It'll give you a good overview of the property, and you can see where the wolves have been most active." Clara accepted a saddle and bridle from Tommy, who seemed eager to help with every aspect of the preparation. Jacob watched her tack up the horse with the fluid movements of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times. Every buckle was checked, every strap adjusted with the precision of a professional. "I'll be back in an hour or so," she said, swinging into the saddle with athletic grace. "Is there anything specific you'd like me to look for?" "Broken fences, wolf sign, anything that looks out of place," Jacob said. "And be careful. This country can be unforgiving to someone who doesn't know it." Clara gathered the reins with confident hands, and Jacob was struck by how natural she looked on horseback. The uncertainty and wariness that had characterized her demeanor since the auction seemed to fall away, replaced by something that approached joy. "I'll be careful," she promised, then looked down at Tommy. "Would you like to come along? 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. Tommy's face transformed with delight, but he looked questioningly at his father for permission. Jacob felt a familiar stab of overprotectiveness war with his recognition that the boy needed experiences beyond the confines of their grief-shadowed ranch. "Stay close to Miss Clara," he said finally, "and do exactly what she tells you." As Tommy scrambled to saddle his own small mare, Lucy appeared at Jacob's side with her lower lip thrust out in an expression he recognized as the precursor to tears. "I want to go too," she said plaintively. "Why can't I go riding with Tommy and Miss Clara?" Jacob knelt to her level, his large hands gentle on her small shoulders. "Because someone needs to help me with the chores around here," he said, "and because Miss Clara doesn't know the country well enough yet to keep track of 2 children at once." Lucy considered this explanation with the seriousness she brought to all adult reasoning, then nodded reluctantly. "Can I go next time?" she asked. "We'll see," Jacob said, the standard parental response that committed to nothing while leaving room for hope. As Clara and Tommy rode out together, Jacob found himself watching until they disappeared around a bend in the trail. There was something about seeing them together, the tall woman and the small boy, that stirred emotions he wasn't prepared to examine. It looked natural, right in a way that made him think of possibilities he had given up on months ago. "Papa," Lucy said, tugging on his coat to reclaim his attention, "Miss Clara makes the house feel different." "Different how?" Jacob asked, curious about his daughter's perceptions. Lucy thought for a moment, her young face serious with concentration. "Warmer," she said finally, "like when Mama was alive, but different too. Miss Clara's kind of warm is stronger, like she could protect us from bad things." The observation was startling in its insight, suggesting that his 6-year-old daughter had perceived something about Clara that Jacob was only beginning to recognize himself. There was indeed a quality of strength about their unexpected guest, a sense that she had weathered storms and emerged capable of weathering more. "She seems like a capable woman," Jacob agreed carefully, not wanting to encourage Lucy to build unrealistic hopes about Clara's permanent place in their lives. "Are you going to marry her?" Lucy asked with the devastating directness that only children possessed. Jacob felt heat rise in his face at the unexpected question. "Lucy, that's not something you should be asking about," he said. "Miss Clara just arrived yesterday. People don't make such important decisions that quickly." "But do you like her?" Lucy persisted. "The way you liked Mama." The question hung in the air between them, impossible to answer simply. Jacob had loved Rebecca with the wholehearted devotion of a young man discovering romance for the first time. What he felt toward Clara was something else entirely, more complex and harder to define. Respect certainly, gratitude for her help with the children and the ranch, and something else, something that might have been attraction if he allowed himself to acknowledge it. "Miss Clara is a good woman," he said finally, "and she's helping our family when we need it most. That's enough to think about for now." Lucy seemed satisfied with this non-answer, or perhaps simply distracted by the appearance of the barn cat stalking something invisible in the tall grass. She skipped off in pursuit of the animal, leaving Jacob alone with his thoughts and the endless list of tasks that demanded his attention. But as he went about his morning chores, feeding the pigs and chickens, checking the condition of his tools, assessing which fences needed the most urgent repair, Jacob found his mind wandering repeatedly to the woman and boy riding through his pastures. Clara's quick assessment of his cattle had been accurate and insightful, suggesting experience with ranch operations that went beyond basic domestic skills. Who was she really? What circumstances had brought her from a Kansas farm to an auction block in Colorado? And what did she hope to gain from this arrangement that had so unexpectedly brought her into his family's life? The questions multiplied rather than resolved as the morning wore on. But Jacob found himself looking forward to Clara's return with an anticipation that had nothing to do with concern for Tommy's safety and everything to do with learning more about this mysterious woman who seemed to possess exactly the skills his struggling ranch most desperately needed. Part 4. Trust Building. Clara and Tommy returned from their ride just as the sun reached its zenith, their horses lathered with honest sweat and their faces carrying the satisfaction of productive work accomplished. Jacob met them at the corral, noting immediately that both riders had the alert, slightly windblown look of people who had covered considerable ground at a decent pace. "How did Blaze behave for you?" Jacob asked as Clara dismounted with the same fluid grace she had shown earlier. "Like a gentleman," Clara replied, running an affectionate hand down the horse's neck. "And Tommy is an excellent riding companion. He knows this country better than some men twice his age." Tommy beamed at the praise, his usually solemn face transformed by pride and accomplishment. "Miss Clara said, I sit a horse like I was born to it," he reported to his father, "and she let me show her the secret way down to Willow Creek that you taught me." Jacob felt a complex mixture of emotions at his son's obvious happiness. It had been months since he had seen Tommy so animated, so eager to share experiences and observations. Clara's presence seemed to be drawing the boy out of the protective shell he had built around himself since his mother's death. "What did you think of the northern pastures?" Jacob asked Clara as she began unsaddling Blaze with Tommy's eager assistance. Clara's expression grew more serious as she considered her response. "The grass is better than I expected for this elevation," she said, "but you're not utilizing it effectively. Your cattle are staying in the lower areas where they feel safer, which means they're overgrazing the good grass and ignoring the higher meadows entirely." Her assessment confirmed what Jacob had suspected but hadn't wanted to admit. Moving cattle to higher elevations required constant supervision and protection from predators, work that was difficult to manage single-handed while also maintaining the dozen other responsibilities that kept a ranch functioning. "I know," he said simply, "but moving them higher means more exposure to wolves and I can't be everywhere at once." "No, you can't," Clara agreed, "but two people working together could manage it. One person to move the cattle, another to watch for threats and maintain the boundaries." She paused in her work, her hands still on the saddle, and looked directly at Jacob. "I'm not just talking about riding around looking at scenery," she said. "I mean real ranch work, herding, night watches, fence repair, whatever needs doing." Jacob stared at her, trying to process what she was suggesting. In his experience, women contributed to ranch operations through domestic work and sometimes light chores around the barnyard, but the idea of a woman participating in the heavy physical labor and dangerous responsibilities of cattle ranching was almost unthinkable. "You're talking about wolf country," he said carefully, "and terrain that can kill a horse and rider if they make the wrong move. It's not work for someone who doesn't know the country." Clara's eyes flashed with something that might have been irritation, quickly controlled but unmistakable. "I've been working cattle since I was 12 years old," she said, evenly, "and I've dealt with wolves, coyotes, mountain lions and every other predator that walks on four legs. The country is different here, but the principles are the same." There was steel in her voice now, the quiet confidence of someone stating facts rather than making boasts. Jacob found himself reassessing his assumptions about this woman who had appeared so suddenly in their lives. "Tell me about Kansas," he said, genuinely curious now about her background. Clara finished removing Blaze's tack and led the horse to the water trough before answering. "My father had a spread outside Topeka," she said finally. "Not huge but big enough to require year-round work. My mother died when I was 10, so I learned to do whatever needed doing. By the time I was 15 I could handle any job on the ranch as well as any of the hired men." She paused, her expression growing distant with memory. "When the drought hit and we lost most of the herd, Papa tried to hold on too long. Lost the ranch, lost everything. That's when I learned that sometimes a woman has to make her own way in the world, no matter how difficult that path might be." The simple recitation didn't reveal the full story, Jacob realized, but it explained the competence he had observed in her handling of horses and her quick assessment of his cattle operation. Clara wasn't a woman playing at ranch work, she was someone with legitimate experience and skills. "What happened after you lost the ranch?" he asked. Clara's face closed off slightly, the same careful expression she had worn when he first asked about her past. Various things, she said. Worked for other ranchers when I could find it. Did what was necessary to survive when I couldn't. The vague answer suggested experiences she wasn't ready to share, possibly painful ones that had eventually led to her being sold at auction in Pine Ridge. Jacob recognized the boundary and chose to respect it, though his curiosity was far from satisfied. If you're serious about working cattle, he said, instead, we should start with something small, see how you handle the conditions here. Clara nodded, apparently accepting the test as reasonable. What did you have in mind? There's a dozen head that have wandered down into the creek bottom, Jacob said. They need to be moved back to higher ground before they get too comfortable down there. The footing's treacherous when it's wet, and there's not enough grass to sustain them for long. Sounds straightforward, Clara said. When do we start? After lunch, Jacob decided. Give the horses time to rest and give you time to get a feel for how we do things around here. Tommy had been listening to this exchange with rapt attention, and now he stepped forward with the kind of determined expression that usually preceded important announcements. I want to help too, he said firmly. I know where those cattle are, and I know which ones are likely to cause trouble. Jacob's first instinct was to refuse, to keep
his son safely away from an operation that could turn dangerous if the cattle spooked or if wolves appeared. But looking at Tommy's face, seeing the eagerness and confidence there, he realized that protecting the boy from all risks might be doing him more harm than good. You can ride along, he said finally, but you stay back from the actual work and you do exactly what Miss Clara or I tell you to do. Tommy nodded solemnly, understanding that this was both privilege and responsibility. Yes, sir, he said. I'll be careful. As they walked back toward the cabin for lunch, Lucy came running to meet them with her face flushed with excitement and her dress streaked with dirt from some adventure in the yard. Papa! Miss Clara! She called breathlessly. Come see what I found in the garden. She grabbed Clara's hand and tugged her toward the overgrown plot that had once been Rebecca's pride and joy. Jacob followed, curious about what could have generated such enthusiasm in his daughter. In the midst of the weeds and volunteer plants, Lucy had discovered a cluster of wild strawberry plants, their tiny white flowers promising sweet fruit in the weeks to come. The plants had somehow survived the neglect that had claimed most of Rebecca's carefully tended vegetables, thriving in a corner where morning sun and afternoon shade created perfect growing conditions. Look how many there are! Lucy exclaimed, pointing to at least a dozen healthy plants spreading their runners through the rich soil. Miss Clara, do you think we could make jam like Mama used to? Clara knelt beside the strawberry patch, her experienced hands gently examining the plants with the care of someone who understood their value. These are beautiful specimens, she said admiringly. With proper care they should produce enough berries for jam, fresh eating, and maybe even some to trade in town. Jacob watched Clara's face as she surveyed the abandoned garden, seeing something shift in her expression. Where he saw only failure and painful reminders of loss, she seemed to see possibility. Her eyes moved methodically across the overgrown plot, cataloging what remained and what could be reclaimed. The soil is excellent, she murmured, more to herself than to them. Rich and well drained. Your wife knew what she was doing when she laid this out. Mama could grow anything, Lucy said proudly, even flowers that the catalog said wouldn't grow this high in the mountains. Clara smiled at the little girl's obvious pride in her mother's accomplishments. That takes real skill, she agreed. Understanding microclimates and soil conditions, knowing which varieties will adapt to unusual circumstances. Your mama was a true gardener. The reverent way Clara spoke about Rebecca's abilities touched something deep in Jacob's chest. So many people had offered condolences about his wife's death, but few had taken the time to understand what made her special while she lived. Clara's recognition of Rebecca's gardening expertise felt like a gift, acknowledgement of skills that deserved to be remembered and honored. Could we bring it back? Lucy asked, her voice small with hope. The garden, I mean. Could we make it beautiful again like it was when Mama was alive? Clara glanced at Jacob before answering, clearly understanding that this decision involved more than simple agricultural planning. The garden represented memory, grief, and the possibility of moving forward while still honoring the past. Gardens are meant to grow and change, Clara said carefully. We could restore what's here and add new things too. Create something that honors your mama's work while making it our own.
The word hour hung in the air with unexpected weight. Clara had been with them for barely 24 hours, yet she was already thinking in terms of shared ownership, collective investment in their future. Jacob found the assumption both presumptuous and oddly comforting. It would be a lot of work, he said, testing her commitment to the idea. All worthwhile things require work, Clara replied pragmatically, but it's work that pays dividends for years. Good soil, properly managed, keeps producing long after the initial investment of time and effort. Tommy, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up with the directness that characterized his rare contributions to conversation. Mama always said the garden was her way of taking care of us, he said. Even when we couldn't see it growing, she knew it was going to feed us later. The profound observation from his 8-year-old son caught Jacob off guard. Tommy had clearly been paying attention to Rebecca's philosophy about delayed gratification and long-term planning, concepts that most children struggled to understand. Your mama was a wise woman, Clara said gently, and she was right about gardens being a way to take care of the people we love. Would you like to help me figure out what we could plant here? Tommy nodded eagerly, his reserve melting away in the face of Clara's genuine interest in his participation. I remember where Mama planted the corn, he said, and the beans that climbed up the poles, and there was a special place for her herbs that smelled good when you rubbed the leaves. Clara listened with the serious attention she might have given an adult consultant, asking thoughtful questions about sun exposure, water drainage, and Rebecca's rotation schedule. Jacob realized she was drawing information from Tommy that the boy had absorbed through observation but had never been asked to articulate. We should start with soil preparation, Clara decided after completing her survey. Clear the weeds, work in some compost if we can find it, maybe add some of that rich creek bottom soil to improve the tilth. When? Lucy asked, bouncing slightly with excitement. Soon, Clara promised, but first we need to take care of some cattle that have wandered where they shouldn't be. Ranch work comes first, then we can focus on the garden. The afternoon's cattle work proved to be both educational and successful. Clara's assessment of the strays' location was accurate, and her approach to moving them demonstrated the kind of practical experience that couldn't be faked. She positioned herself to anticipate their movements, reading their body language with the fluency of someone who had spent years working with livestock. Tommy proved invaluable as a scout, his knowledge of the terrain allowing him to predict which routes the cattle would prefer and which obstacles might cause problems. Jacob found himself genuinely impressed by his son's contributions, realizing that the boy had been absorbing ranch knowledge even during the months of silence that had followed his mother's death. That heifer there, Clara called out, pointing to a particularly stubborn animal that kept trying to break away from the group. She's the leader. Control her movements and the others will follow. Jacob nodded, adjusting his position to block the heifer's preferred escape route. Working in coordination with Clara felt natural, their movements complementing each other as if they had been partnering for years rather than hours. When a sudden noise in the brush caused the cattle to startle and bunch together nervously, Clara's hand moved instinctively to the rifle scabbard on her saddle. Her eyes swept the tree line with the alertness of someone accustomed to threats that might materialize without warning. Just a deer, Tommy called out from his observation post on higher ground. Big buck, heading away from us. Clara relaxed slightly but didn't fully lower her guard until they had successfully moved the cattle to safer ground. Her caution impressed Jacob, who had seen too many people become careless around livestock and wilderness dangers. You handle yourself well out here, he said, as they rode back toward the ranch buildings. Kansas taught me that relaxing at the wrong moment can get you killed, Clara replied matter-of-factly. Whether it's weather, predators, or just cattle being unpredictable, staying alert is what keeps you alive. As they unsaddled their horses, Jacob found himself studying Clara with new appreciation for her competence. She moved with the efficiency of someone whose survival had depended on doing things right the first time, every time. Tomorrow we should check the eastern boundary, he said, making the decision to continue testing her abilities. There's been some fence damage from the winter storms, and I want to assess what needs immediate attention. Sounds good, Clara agreed. Will we need pack animals for tools and materials? The question demonstrated practical thinking about the logistics of fence repair in rough country. Jacob nodded, impressed once again by her understanding of ranch operations. I'll load the pack mule tonight, he said. We'll want to get an early start if we're going to cover all the ground that needs checking. That evening's supper was another revelation of Clara's domestic skills. Using ingredients that Jacob would have struggled to turn into an edible meal, she produced something that both children devoured with obvious pleasure. The conversation around the table was more natural than any they had shared since Rebecca's death, punctuated by Lucy's questions about garden planning and Tommy's observations about the day's cattle work. After the children were settled for the night, Jacob and Clara found themselves sitting on the cabin's front porch, watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, the kind of quiet that developed between people who had worked together successfully and found the experience mutually satisfactory. "This is beautiful country," Clara said finally, her voice soft in the darkness. "Harsh but beautiful. I can see why your family chose to make a life here." "My grandfather picked this spot," Jacob said. "Said the mountains would protect us from whatever troubles the outside world might bring. He wasn't wrong about that, but he didn't account for the troubles that could develop right here at home." Clara turned slightly to look at him, though the darkness made it difficult to read her expression. "You mean the wolves, or something else?" Jacob considered how much to reveal about their financial struggles, their isolation, the dozens of challenges that made each day a battle for survival. "Everything," he said finally. "Wolves, weather, equipment breaking down, cattle getting sick, not enough money to fix what breaks or replace what gets lost. Sometimes it feels like the mountains are trying to push us out, or test you," Clara suggested. "See if you're strong enough to deserve what they offer." The perspective was one Jacob hadn't considered, but it resonated with something deep in his understanding of the relationship between people and the land they tried to claim. The mountains didn't surrender their bounty easily, but those who proved themselves worthy could find rewards that made the struggle worthwhile. "You really think you want to stay here?" he asked, suddenly aware that their arrangement had no defined endpoint. "This isn't easy country for anyone, especially not for someone who's already been through difficulties." Clara was quiet for so long that Jacob began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of careful consideration. "I've been running for a long time," she said. "From circumstances, from choices I made, from consequences I couldn't control. Running becomes a habit after a while, even when you're not sure what you're running from anymore." She paused, her gaze fixed on the distant peaks silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "Your children need stability. They need to know that the people they care about won't disappear without warning. And maybe I need to know what it feels like to build something instead of always looking for the next escape route." The admission revealed more about Clara's recent past than anything she had said previously. Jacob understood about running, about the way grief and failure could make a person want to keep moving rather than face the reality of loss and responsibility. "Building something here requires commitment," he said carefully. "The mountains don't tolerate half measures or temporary effort. If you're going to stay, it has to be with the understanding that leaving becomes harder the longer you're here." "I understand," Clara said, "and I'm not looking for easy anymore. I'm looking for worthwhile." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, each lost in private thoughts about the future they might be creating together. When Clara finally rose to return to her quarters in the barn, Jacob found himself reluctant to end the conversation. "Clara," he called softly as she reached the porch steps. She turned back, a question in her posture. "Thank you," he said simply, "for today, for helping with the children, for seeing possibilities where I was only seeing problems. It's been a long time since I felt like things might actually get better instead of just more difficult." Clara's response was barely audible in the mountain darkness, but it carried clearly in the still air. "Thank you for giving me a chance to find out who I could be instead of just who I've been." As Jacob watched her disappear into the barn, he realized that their arrangement had already evolved beyond the simple transaction that had brought Clara to his ranch. She wasn't just helping with domestic work or even ranch operations. She was becoming part of the fabric of their family life in ways that felt both natural and significant. The thought should have worried him, given how little he knew about her past and how recently Rebecca's death had shattered his previous understanding of family. Instead, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow's work with an anticipation he hadn't felt in months. Clara Bennett was proving to be exactly what his struggling ranch needed, but more importantly, she was becoming what his wounded family required for healing. Whether that development would prove sustainable remained to be seen, but for the first time since the rockslide that had claimed his wife and youngest child, Jacob allowed himself to believe that their story might have chapters beyond mere survival. Part 4. Shadows from the past 3 weeks had passed since Clara's arrival at the Stone Ranch, and the transformation was visible in every aspect of their daily life. The garden showed neat rows of newly planted vegetables, their green shoots pushing through rich soil that had been carefully prepared and amended. The children's clothes were properly mended and clean, their hair neatly arranged each morning. Even the ranch operations ran more smoothly, with Clara's experienced assistance allowing Jacob to accomplish tasks that had been beyond his solitary capabilities. Most significantly, the oppressive silence that had characterized their home since Rebecca's death had been replaced by something approaching normal family conversation. Lucy chattered constantly about her garden projects and the stories Clara told her during their evening hairbrushing sessions. Tommy, while still quiet by nature, had begun offering observations and asking questions that demonstrated his engagement with the world around him. Jacob found himself watching Clara with growing appreciation for the skills she brought to their operation. She could handle any job on the ranch with competence that matched or exceeded many men he had known. Her understanding of cattle behavior, weather patterns and land management spoke of experience gained through years of practical application rather than casual observation. Yet despite the obvious benefits of her presence, Jacob remained aware that Clara's past held secrets she wasn't ready to share. Sometimes he caught her staring toward the mountain passes with an expression of wariness, as if she expected unwelcome visitors to appear at any moment. She deflected personal questions with practiced skill, revealing only enough information to satisfy immediate curiosity while keeping the deeper stories of her life carefully guarded. On this particular morning, Jacob was repairing a section of fence in the eastern pasture when he noticed a rider approaching from the direction of Pine Ridge. The distance made identification impossible, but something about the purposeful way the horseman navigated the mountain trail suggested this wasn't a casual visitor. Clara, who had been working nearby with a post-hole digger, straightened at Jacob's alert posture. Her eyes followed his gaze to the approaching rider, and Jacob saw her expression shift from curiosity to something approaching alarm. "Do you recognize him?" Jacob asked, noting the tension that had suddenly appeared in Clara's shoulders. Clara shaded her eyes against the morning sun, studying the distant figure with intensity that suggested more than casual interest. "No," she said finally, but Jacob heard uncertainty in her voice. "At least I don't think so, but riders coming alone usually bring news, and news isn't always good." As the horseman drew closer, Jacob could make out more details. The man was well dressed by frontier standards, with a quality horse and equipment that spoke of means beyond those of most local residents. His riding style was confident and efficient, suggesting someone accustomed to covering long distances quickly. "Jacob Stone," the stranger called out as he approached within conversational distance. "That's me," Jacob replied, his hand instinctively moving closer to the revolver at his hip. Strangers who knew his name without introduction warranted caution in country where privacy was both valued and necessary for survival. The rider dismounted with fluid grace, revealing himself to be a man of perhaps 40 years with the kind of careful grooming that suggested urban origins. His clothes were practical but expensive, and his manner carried the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention and respect. "Richard Caldwell," the man said, offering his hand in introduction. "I've ridden up from Denver on business that I believe concerns both of us." Jacob accepted the handshake warily, noting the soft condition of Caldwell's hands despite his obvious riding skills. This was not a man who earned his living through physical labor. "What kind of business?" Jacob asked bluntly. Caldwell's gaze moved to Clara, who had positioned herself slightly behind Jacob but remained within earshot of their conversation. "Business that might be better discussed privately," he said meaningfully. "Anything you have to say can be said in front of Miss Bennett," Jacob replied firmly. "She's part of this ranch operation." Something flickered in Caldwell's eyes at the mention of Clara's name, a recognition that was quickly masked but unmistakable. "Miss Bennett," he repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting. The woman I'm looking for has been known by several names over the past few years." Clara stepped forward, her chin raised in a gesture of defiance that Jacob had come to recognize as her response to perceived threats. "What woman would that be?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the obvious tension in her posture. Caldwell smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. A woman who disappeared from Kansas under circumstances that left several outstanding obligations, he said smoothly. Financial obligations that have continued to accrue interest during her absence. I don't know what you're talking about, Clara said flatly. Don't you? Caldwell reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. I have here a signed confession of debt, acknowledging responsibility for damages incurred during a violent altercation that resulted in significant property destruction and personal injury. Jacob felt cold dread settle in his stomach as he realized this conversation was moving toward territory that could threaten everything they had built over the past 3 weeks. Whatever Clara's past held, it had apparently followed her to Colorado. Let me see that, he said, extending his hand for the document. Caldwell hesitated, clearly preferring to maintain control of the evidence. This is a legal matter between Miss Bennet and my clients, he said. I'm not sure it's appropriate to involve third parties. I'm not a third party, Jacob said firmly. Miss Bennet is under my protection, which makes this my business as well. The word protection seemed to amuse Caldwell, though he maintained his professional demeanor. Protection, he repeated. That's admirable, Mr. Stone, but I'm afraid the law doesn't recognize such informal arrangements when it comes to outstanding debts and criminal liability. Clara's face had gone pale during this exchange, but her voice remained controlled when she spoke. What exactly are you claiming I owe? She asked. $700 in direct damages, Caldwell replied promptly, plus accumulated interest and legal fees, bringing the total to just over $1,000. Additionally, there's the matter of criminal charges that could be filed if the debt remains unpaid. The enormous sum hung in the air like a death sentence. Jacob knew that kind of money represented more than most ranchers earned in 2 years of hard work. Even if Clara's claims were completely false, proving that in court would require resources and legal expertise that were far beyond their means. What criminal charges? Jacob asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Caldwell's smile widened slightly, revealing his confidence in the strength of his position. Assault with a deadly weapon, he said. Destruction of property. Theft of livestock and equipment. The list is quite extensive actually. Those are lies, Clara said quietly, but Jacob heard the fear underlying her defiance. That's for a court to determine, Caldwell replied smoothly, though I'm authorized to offer a settlement that would avoid the unpleasantness of criminal proceedings. What kind of settlement? Jacob asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Miss Bennet returns with me to Kansas to face her obligations, Caldwell said. In exchange, my clients would be willing to accept partial payment and forego the criminal charges. The proposal was clearly designed to force Clara into compliance through the threat of prosecution. Jacob understood that fighting such charges, even if they were completely fabricated, would require time and money that could bankrupt a family and leave Clara imprisoned regardless of her actual guilt or innocence. I need time to consider this, Clara said finally. Caldwell consulted a gold pocket watch with theatrical precision. I'm afraid time is something we don't have much of, he said regretfully. My clients have been remarkably patient, but their forbearance isn't unlimited. I'll need an answer by tomorrow morning. And if we refuse? Jacob asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear it stated explicitly. Then I'll be forced to involve the local authorities, Caldwell said. Sheriff's departments have been alerted across 3 territories about Miss Bennet's situation. It would be unfortunate if she were to be arrested and extradited under less favorable circumstances. The threat was clear and comprehensive. Caldwell had apparently prepared for multiple contingencies, creating a web of legal pressure that would be difficult to escape regardless of the truth underlying his claims. Where are you staying? Jacob asked, accepting the inevitable delay while they considered their limited options. The hotel in Pine Ridge, Caldwell replied. Room 7, if you need to reach me before morning. He remounted his horse with the same fluid motion he had shown in dismounting. I do hope we can resolve this matter amicably, for everyone's sake. As Caldwell rode away, Jacob and Clara stood in silence, watching his figure disappear down the mountain trail. The peaceful morning had been shattered by the arrival of threats that seemed to offer no good solutions. Is any of it true? Jacob asked. Finally, though he kept his voice carefully neutral. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant peaks. Some of it, she said finally. not the way he's presenting it, but some of the basic facts are accurate. The admission hit Jacob like a physical blow, though he had prepared himself for the possibility that Clara's past contained genuinely problematic elements. "Tell me," he said simply. Clara began walking back toward the ranch buildings, her movements deliberate but lacking their usual confident energy. Jacob fell into step beside her, waiting for explanations that might change everything he thought he understood about the woman who had become so important to his family's well-being. "There was a man in Kansas," Clara began, her voice careful and controlled. "Victor Caldwell, Richard's younger brother. He owned a large spread near our farm, and when my father lost everything in the drought, Victor offered to help." She paused at the corral fence, her hands gripping the rough wood as if drawing strength from its solidity. The help came with conditions. Victor had a reputation with women, married and unmarried alike. But he was powerful and my father was desperate. Jacob felt sick understanding begin to form in his mind. What kind of conditions? The kind that a 17-year-old girl shouldn't have to consider, Clara said bitterly. But when your family is facing starvation, you make choices you never thought you'd have to make. The story that emerged was ugly in its familiarity, a tale of power used to exploit vulnerability and desperation. Victor Caldwell had indeed offered assistance to Clara's family, but the price had been Clara's compliance with his desires and availability for his pleasure whenever he demanded it. "I tried to endure it," Clara said, her voice growing harder with each word. "Told myself it was temporary, that we could save the farm and eventually escape his influence. But Victor's appetites weren't just physical. He enjoyed the control, the degradation, the knowledge that he could destroy us whenever he chose." Jacob's hands clenched into fists as he listened, anger building at a dead man he had never met but already despised with visceral intensity. "What changed?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would be even more difficult to hear. "Victor started talking about making the arrangement permanent," Clara said. "Marriage, he called it, though everyone understood it would be slavery with legal protection. And he wanted children, heirs who would inherit both his property and his father's political connections." Clara's voice faltered slightly, and Jacob saw her swallow hard before continuing. "When I refused, he became violent, not just with me but with my father, my younger sister. He said we needed to understand the consequences of defying him." The picture was becoming clearer, and Jacob understood that whatever had followed must have been desperate and dangerous for Clara to have ended up fleeing Kansas entirely. "I killed him," Clara said quietly, the words falling like stones into still water. "Shot him with my father's old rifle while he was attacking my sister. Watched him bleed out on our kitchen floor while I held her and tried to stop her crying." The confession hung between them, brutal in its simplicity. Jacob found himself studying Clara's profile, seeing her not as the competent ranch hand who had become indispensable to his operation, but as a young woman who had been forced to choose between murder and the continued abuse of everyone she loved. "The $700, he asked. "Funeral expenses, property damage from the fight, legal fees for the inquest that cleared me of criminal charges," Clara said. "All perfectly legitimate expenses that Victor's father insisted our family should pay despite the circumstances that led to his son's death. And you ran instead of paying." Clara turned to face him directly, her gray-green eyes holding depths of pain and determination that took his breath away. "I ran because Judge Caldwell made it clear that clearing me legally didn't mean he was finished with me," she said. "He wanted Victor's death to cost my family everything, and he had the power to make that happen through legal channels that would appear perfectly proper to outside observers." The pieces were falling into place now, revealing a picture of systematic persecution that had driven Clara from her home and family into years of wandering that had eventually led to her being sold at auction in Pine Ridge. "Your father, your sister, dead," Clara said flatly. "Both of them within 6 months of my leaving. Father took sick and couldn't afford proper medical care. My sister, the attack damaged her in ways that never healed properly. She died of complications that a good doctor might have prevented." Jacob felt the weight of Clara's losses settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. She had sacrificed everything to protect her family, only to learn that her absence had condemned them to exactly the fate she had tried to prevent. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to offer what comfort he could. Richard Caldwell isn't here about money, Clara said, ignoring his sympathy in favor of practical concerns. He's here because his father wants to finish what he started 3 years ago. He wants me destroyed, and he's been patient enough to wait for the right opportunity. The implications were staggering. If Clara was right, then
Caldwell's arrival wasn't coincidental but rather the culmination of a long campaign of revenge that had finally tracked her to Colorado. "What do you want to do?" Jacob asked, though he already knew that their options were severely limited. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving across the ranch that had become her sanctuary and his children who had begun to see her as family. "I won't bring this down on you and the children," she said finally. "You've given me more kindness in 3 weeks than I've known in 3 years. I won't repay that by destroying everything you've worked to build." "That's not your decision to make alone," Jacob said firmly. "We're partners, remember? That means we face problems together." Clara's expression softened slightly at his words, but her resolve remained evident. "Some problems are too big to share," she said. "And some fights aren't worth the price they demand from innocent people." As they stood together in the morning sunlight, watching Jacob's children play in the distance while thunderclouds gathered over the mountains, both of them understood that their peaceful interlude was ending. The past had finally caught up with Clara Bennett, and the choices they made in the next 24 hours would determine whether the family they had begun to build together could survive the storm that was about to break over them. That evening the Stone family gathered around their dinner table for what might be their last meal together. Clara had prepared a feast from their garden's early harvest and preserved stores, as if she could somehow make the moment last forever through the simple act of providing abundance. Tommy and Lucy chattered about their day's adventures, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension that flowed between the adults. Jacob watched Clara during the meal, noting how she memorized every detail of the children's animated faces, how she stored up their laughter like a woman preparing for a long winter. When Lucy asked Clara to braid her hair before bed, the simple request nearly broke the careful composure Clara had maintained throughout the day. "Of course, little dove," Clara said, her voice only slightly unsteady. "We'll make it extra special tonight." After the children were settled in their beds upstairs, Jacob and Clara found themselves once again on the front porch, but the comfortable silence of previous evenings had been replaced by the weight of unspoken decisions. The mountain air carried the scent of approaching rain, and lightning flickered in the distance over Thunder Peak. "I've been thinking about what Caldwell said," Jacob began carefully. "About the legal situation, the money, all of it." Clara shifted in her chair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Jacob, you can't possibly be considering trying to fight this. The Caldwells have resources, connections, political influence across 3 territories. They could destroy you and still have enough power left over to ruin your children's futures." "Maybe," Jacob acknowledged. "But running hasn't solved anything for you in 3 years. Maybe it's time to make a stand." "A stand that could cost you everything," Clara protested. "Your ranch, your freedom, your children's security. I won't be responsible for that kind of destruction." Jacob rose from his chair and moved to lean against the porch railing, his massive frame silhouetted against the storm-lit sky. "You know what I realized today while I was thinking about all this," he said. "I realized that I'd rather fight for something worth keeping than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to try." Clara's breath caught at his words, and she stood to join him at the railing. "You don't understand what you're saying," she whispered. "The Caldwells don't just destroy their enemies, they make examples of them. They ensure that anyone who opposes them suffers consequences so severe that others think twice before crossing them. Then maybe it's time someone showed them that not everyone can be intimidated," Jacob said quietly. "Maybe it's time they learned that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the cost." Thunder rumbled across the valley and the first fat raindrops began to spatter against the porch roof. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, whether against the chill or against the emotions threatening to overwhelm her careful control. "I can't let you do this," she said. "I won't let you sacrifice your children's future for me." Jacob turned to face her fully, his steel-gray eyes intense in the flickering lightning. "It's not just for you anymore," he said. "It's for us, for the family we've become, for the life we've started building together. You think I'm going to let some corrupt judge and his hired gun tear apart everything we've created because they can't stand the idea that their precious son faced consequences for his actions?" The rain began in earnest now, drumming against the roof and filling the air with the clean scent of water on dust. Clara stared at Jacob as if seeing him clearly for the first time, recognizing something in his expression that she had never allowed herself to hope for.
"You're talking about fighting the most powerful family in Kansas," she said. "They have judges, sheriffs, politicians in their pocket. They can make evidence disappear and witnesses change their stories. What do we have to fight them with?" "The truth," Jacob said simply, "and each other. And the fact that this is our ground, our territory, our rules instead of theirs." Clara shook her head, tears mingling with the rain that was beginning to blow onto the covered porch. "The truth hasn't been enough to protect anyone from the Caldwells before," she said. "Why would it be enough now?" "Because this time you're not facing them alone," Jacob replied. "This time you have people who believe in you, who know who you really are instead of the lies they've been spreading about you." The conversation was interrupted by a small voice from the cabin doorway. Tommy stood there in his nightclothes, his young face creased with worry and confusion. "Papa?" he said, uncertainly. "I heard voices. Is everything all right?" Jacob's heart clenched at the sight of his son's obvious anxiety. Tommy had already lost so much, had already endured trauma that no child should have to face. The idea of putting him through another upheaval was almost unbearable. "Come here, son," Jacob said gently, opening his arms to the boy. Tommy ran to his father, burying his face against Jacob's broad chest with the desperate intensity of a child seeking reassurance. "Is Miss Clara leaving?" he asked, his voice muffled but audible. "I heard her talking about going away." Clara's composure finally cracked at the boy's question. She knelt beside Tommy, her hands gentle on his thin shoulders. "I might have to go away for a while," she said, honestly. "There are some problems from before I came here that I need to take care of." Tommy pulled back to look at her, his blue eyes wide with the kind of understanding that children sometimes possess about adult situations. "Is it because of the man who came today?" he asked. "The one who made you scared?" Clara's eyes widened in surprise. She had thought she had hidden her reaction to Caldwell's visit, but Tommy's observational skills had apparently been sharper than she realized. "How did you know I was scared?" she asked, gently. "You stood different," Tommy said with the matter-of-fact honesty of childhood. "Like when the wolves get too close to the cattle, ready to fight but hoping you don't have to." The comparison was startlingly accurate, and Clara found herself amazed by this quiet boy's insight into emotional nuances that many adults would have missed. "You're very observant," she said softly. "Yes, I was scared. The man who came today wants me to go back to a place where bad things happened before." Tommy considered this information with the seriousness he brought to all adult matters. "Will you be safe if you go back?" he asked. Clara's throat tightened at the direct question. "I don't know," she admitted. "Probably not." "Then you shouldn't go," Tommy said with the simple logic of childhood. "Papa always says we shouldn't do things that aren't safe unless we have no other choice." Jacob felt a surge of pride at his son's wisdom, even as his heart broke for the circumstances that had forced the boy to think about such serious matters. "Tommy's right," he said. "We don't send family into danger if there's any way to avoid it." The word family seemed to hang in the rain-filled air, carrying implications that none of them had explicitly acknowledged before. Clara looked between Jacob and Tommy, seeing acceptance and belonging in their faces that she had never dared to hope for. "But what if staying brings danger to the family?" she asked, quietly. "What if the only way to keep you and Lucy safe is for me to face whatever's waiting for me back in Kansas?" Tommy's grip on his father tightened, and Jacob saw determination settle over the boy's features. "We're stronger together," Tommy said, echoing something Jacob had told him after Rebecca's death. "Mama used to say that families don't leave people behind when things get hard." The profound statement from his 8-year-old son crystallized something that had been forming in Jacob's mind throughout the day. This wasn't just about Clara's past or Caldwell's threats. This was about what kind of man he wanted to be, what kind of father he wanted his children to remember. "Tommy's right," Jacob said firmly. "We're stronger together, and we don't abandon family. That's not who we are." Clara's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with the rain and everything to do with emotions she had kept carefully suppressed for years. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered. "You don't know what it means to fight the Caldwells." "Then teach me," Jacob said simply. "Tell me everything you know about them, about their methods, about their weaknesses. Help me understand what we're up against so we can figure out how to win." The conversation continued long into the night, with Tommy eventually falling asleep in Jacob's arms while Clara shared the details of her family's destruction at the hands of Judge Caldwell's systematic revenge. She told Jacob about the false witnesses who had appeared to contradict her account of Victor's death, about the legal maneuvers that had stripped her family of their remaining assets, about the network of corruption that made fighting the Caldwells seem hopeless. But as she talked, Jacob began to see patterns and possibilities that Clara's despair had hidden from her. The Caldwells' power was based on their ability to control information and intimidate opposition within their own territory. Here in Colorado, their influence was limited, their network of allies and bought officials non-existent. What if we don't fight them on their ground? Jacob suggested as dawn began to break over the mountains. What if we make them fight on ours? Clara looked at him with exhaustion and the faint stirring of something that might have been hope. What do you mean? Richard Caldwell is here without legal authority, Jacob explained. That document he showed us isn't a warrant, it's a civil claim. He can't arrest you or force you to return to Kansas without going through proper territorial channels. He said he had alerted sheriff's departments across 3 territories. Clara reminded him. About what? A civil debt case. Even if he's told them you're a fugitive, which would be a lie, they'd still need proper extradition papers to remove you from Colorado against your will. Clara sat up straighter, her legal knowledge limited but her instincts telling her that Jacob might be onto something significant. You think his threats about involving local authorities were bluffs? I think Richard Caldwell is gambling that you'll be too scared to call those bluffs, Jacob said. I think he's counting on you running again just like you've been running for 3 years. The analysis resonated with Clara's understanding of Caldwell family methods. They preferred to achieve their goals through intimidation and manipulation rather than direct confrontation, particularly when operating outside their sphere of influence. Even if you're right about the legal situation, Clara said carefully, that doesn't solve the fundamental problem. They want me destroyed, and they have the resources to keep pursuing that goal indefinitely. Unless we give them a reason to stop, Jacob said. Unless we make it cost them more to continue than to give up. Clara stared at him in amazement. You're talking about threatening the Caldwells. Jacob, they're not some local bullies who'll back down if you stand up to them. They're a powerful political family with connections throughout the territorial government. I'm talking about making them understand that some fights aren't worth winning, Jacob replied. That some enemies are more dangerous than they initially appear. The morning sun was breaking through the clouds when Richard Caldwell rode up to the Stone Ranch for the second time, his confident demeanor suggesting he expected to collect Clara and ride away with minimal resistance. Instead, he found Jacob waiting for him in the yard, his Winchester rifle cradled casually but visibly in his arms. Mr. Stone, Caldwell called out, maintaining his horseback position as if to emphasize his intention to depart quickly. I trust you've had time to consider our conversation yesterday. I'm prepared to escort Miss Bennett back to Kansas immediately. Miss Bennett isn't going anywhere, Jacob replied calmly. And I think you know you don't have the legal authority to make her. Caldwell's confident smile faltered slightly. I'm afraid you're mistaken about the legal complexities involved here, he said. Miss Bennett is a fugitive from justice, and harboring fugitives is itself a criminal offense. Is she? Jacob asked. Because I've spent the morning reviewing territorial law regarding extradition procedures, and it seems to me that you'd need proper documentation from a federal judge to remove anyone from Colorado against their will. Documentation you don't appear to possess. The bluff was partially successful. Caldwell's expression shifted from confidence to calculation as he reassessed the situation. The documentation can be obtained, he said carefully. It's simply a matter of proper channels and appropriate fees. Then I suggest you pursue those proper channels, Jacob said. Until you do, Miss Bennett remains under my protection on my property. Caldwell studied Jacob with new attention, apparently recognizing that he had underestimated the opposition he was facing. You're making a serious mistake, Mr. Stone, he said. The Caldwell family has resources and influence that extend far beyond Kansas. We're not people you want to make enemies of, and you're making a mistake if you think threats will work on me. Jacob replied, I've faced wolves, bears, blizzards and droughts in these mountains. I'm not intimidated by some politician's son who thinks money makes him powerful. The dismissive characterization clearly stung Caldwell's pride, and his composure slipped enough to reveal the arrogance underneath his professional manner. You have no idea who you're dealing with, he said coldly. My father controls judges, sheriffs and territorial representatives across half the western territories. He can destroy you financially, legally and personally without breaking a sweat. Your father isn't here, Jacob pointed out, and his influence doesn't extend to every corner of the territory, no matter what he's told you. You're a long way from Kansas, Mr. Caldwell, and you're operating without backup in country that doesn't tolerate bullies. As if summoned by Jacob's words, the sound of multiple horses approaching interrupted their confrontation. Sheriff Hayes from Pine Ridge appeared around the bend in the trail, accompanied by 2 other men Jacob recognized as local ranchers. All 3 were armed and wearing expressions of serious intent. "Morning, Jacob," Sheriff Hayes called out as the group rode into the yard. "Got word there might be some trouble brewing up here." Jacob felt a surge of gratitude for whatever network of communication had brought reinforcements to his side. "Nothing we can't handle, Sheriff," he replied. "Just explaining to Mr. Caldwell here about proper legal procedures for operating in Colorado territory." Sheriff Hayes turned his attention to Caldwell with the kind of professional assessment that lawmen developed after years of dealing with various types of troublemakers. "And you are?" "Richard Caldwell," the man replied, clearly uncomfortable with this unexpected development. "I'm here on legal business regarding a fugitive from Kansas." "Got proper papers for extradition?" Hayes asked bluntly. Caldwell hesitated, apparently recognizing that his intimidation tactics weren't going to work with local law enforcement. "The situation is more complex than simple extradition," he said carefully. "Then maybe you'd better explain that complexity back in town," Hayes suggested firmly, "where we can review whatever documentation you do have and determine the proper procedures for handling your claims." The suggestion carried the weight of a command, and Caldwell clearly understood that refusing would only make his position more precarious. "Very well," he said stiffly, "though I should warn you that interfering with the legitimate pursuit of justice will have consequences for everyone involved." "The only consequences I'm worried about are the ones that come from not following proper legal procedures," Hayes replied. "Let's ride back to town and sort this out through proper channels." As the group prepared to depart, Caldwell turned back to Jacob with an expression of cold fury. "This isn't over, Stone," he said. "You're protecting a killer and a thief, and eventually that protection will cost you everything you care about." "Maybe," Jacob acknowledged, "but at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror afterward." "Can you say the same?" After Caldwell and the sheriff's party disappeared down the trail, Clara emerged from the cabin where she had been watching the confrontation through the kitchen window. Her face was pale but determined, and Jacob could see that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of their situation. "How did Sheriff Hayes know to come here?" she asked. Jacob smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of satisfaction he had felt since Caldwell's initial visit. "I sent Tommy to the Miller Ranch before dawn with a message," he said. "Thomas Miller sent riders to several neighboring ranches, and someone made sure word reached the sheriff. Mountain folk look out for each other when outsiders start making threats." Clara stared at him in amazement. "You planned this whole confrontation?" "I planned to make sure Caldwell understood that he wasn't dealing with an isolated target," Jacob replied. "Bullies like him are used to people being afraid to stand up to them. Sometimes you have to show them that not everyone can be intimidated." The sound of running feet announced Tommy and Lucy's emergence from the cabin, where they had apparently been instructed to stay during the confrontation. Both children ran to Clara, wrapping their arms around her with the desperate relief of young people who had feared losing someone important to them. "Did the bad man go away?" Lucy asked, her blue eyes wide with concern. "For now," Clara said gently, stroking the little girl's hair, "but he might come back. Then we'll be ready," Tommy said with the fierce determination that had characterized his earlier statements. "We won't let him take you away from us." Clara's eyes filled with tears at the boy's protective instincts, so reminiscent of his father's unwavering loyalty. "You two are the bravest children I've ever known," she said softly. "We learned it from Papa," Lucy said proudly. "He says being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right even when you are scared." The innocent repetition of Jacob's philosophy struck Clara with the force of revelation. She looked at Jacob with new understanding of the man she had come to love, seeing not just strength and competence but a moral foundation that had shaped his children and was now offering her something she had never dared to hope for. "Jacob," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something I should have said yesterday." He waited patiently, recognizing the importance of whatever she was preparing to share. "I love you," she said simply. "I love your children. I love this ranch. I love the life we've been building together. And I'm terrified that my past is going to destroy all of it." Jacob's response was to step forward and take her in his arms, holding her with the careful strength that characterized everything he did. "Then we'll make sure it doesn't," he said firmly. "Because I love you too, Clara Bennett." And I'm not letting anyone take you away from us. The kiss they shared was witnessed by Thunder Peak and two children who clapped their hands in delight at this confirmation of what they had already known in their hearts. When they finally separated, Clara's face was radiant with a joy that had been absent for far too long. "So what do we do now?" she asked. "Now we get married," Jacob said matter-of-factly. "Today if Pastor Mitchell is available, because I want it clear to Richard Caldwell and anyone else who comes around here that your family, with all the legal protections that provides." Clara's eyes widened in surprise. "Jacob, you can't possibly want to tie yourself to me legally while all this is unresolved. If the Caldwells find a way to pursue criminal charges, then they'll have to deal with both of us," Jacob interrupted. "As husband and wife with all the legal rights and protections that marriage provides under territorial law." Tommy and Lucy erupted in cheers at this announcement, dancing around the adults with uninhibited joy. Their celebration was infectious, and Clara found herself laughing despite the serious circumstances that surrounded them. "Are you sure?" she asked Jacob quietly. "Marriage isn't something you can undo easily if this all goes wrong." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Jacob replied. "The question is whether you're willing to take a chance on a future that might include fighting powerful enemies and facing uncertain outcomes." Clara looked around at the ranch that had become her sanctuary, at the children who had become her family, at the man who had shown her what love looked like when it was freely given rather than demanded as payment. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm willing to take that chance." The wedding took place that afternoon in the small church in Pine Ridge, with Pastor Mitchell officiating and half the town in attendance despite the short notice. Word had spread quickly about the confrontation with Caldwell, and the community had rallied around Jacob and Clara with the kind of solidarity that characterized frontier settlements. Clara wore a simple blue dress borrowed from Sarah Miller, with wild flowers in her hair that Lucy had gathered from the mountain meadows. Jacob stood beside her in his best suit, his massive frame somehow made gentle by the occasion and his obvious joy in the moment. When Pastor Mitchell asked if anyone objected to the union, Sheriff Hayes stood up from his pew and announced that anyone who did object would need to take it up with him personally after the ceremony. The statement drew laughter and applause from the congregation, but it also served notice that the community was prepared to defend their newest family against outside interference. The reception that followed was a genuine celebration, with neighbors contributing food, music, and stories that helped Clara understand her place in the social fabric of her new home. For the first time in years she felt truly safe, surrounded by people who knew her story and had chosen to accept her regardless of the troubles she brought with her. As evening approached and the newlyweds prepared to return to their ranch, Sheriff Hayes pulled Jacob aside for a private conversation. "Caldwell's gone back to Denver," the sheriff reported, "but he made it clear this isn't over. He'll be back with proper documentation and probably additional support." "How long do we have?" Jacob asked. "Hard to say. Could be weeks, could be months. Depends on how much influence his family really has with federal judges and territorial officials." Jacob nodded, accepting the reality that their victory had been temporary rather than decisive. "What would you advise?" "Document everything," Hayes said firmly. "Get Clara's account of what happened in Kansas written down and witnessed. Gather any evidence you can find to support her version of events. And maybe think about reaching out to some of your own contacts, people who might be able to help when the Caldwells make their next move." The advice was sound, and Jacob filed it away for future action. For tonight, however, he was determined to focus on celebrating the beginning of his new marriage rather than worrying about the challenges that lay ahead. The ride back to the ranch was magical in the way that only mountain evenings could be, with the setting sun painting the peaks in shades of gold and purple while stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Tommy and Lucy rode ahead on their horses, chattering excitedly about their new status as a complete family, while Jacob and Clara followed more slowly, savoring their first moments as husband and wife. "Are you happy?" Jacob asked as they approached their home. Clara's smile was radiant in the starlight. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," she replied. "Even with everything that's uncertain about the future right now, I feel like the luckiest woman in the world." "Good," Jacob said, leaning over to kiss her again. "Because you're stuck with us now, Mrs. Stone. For better or worse, in good times and bad, we're family." "I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be stuck," Clara replied, and her words carried the conviction of someone who had finally found her place in the world. The months that followed brought both challenges and joys in equal measure. Richard Caldwell returned twice, each time with increasingly official documentation and threats, but each time he found himself facing not just Jacob and Clara but an entire community that had decided to protect its own. The legal battles were complex and expensive, but donations from neighbors and the support of local officials helped offset the costs. Clara's garden flourished under her expert care, providing food for the family and surplus to trade in town. Tommy's confidence grew as he took on more responsibilities around the ranch, while Lucy bloomed under Clara's maternal guidance. The ranch itself prospered as Jacob and Clara worked together to implement improvements that neither could have managed alone. Most importantly, the shadow of fear that had haunted Clara for 3 years gradually lifted as she learned to trust in the permanence of her new life. She was no longer running from her past but building toward a future that held promise and possibility. On a crisp autumn morning, as Jacob stood on his porch watching Clara teach Lucy how to braid wildflowers while Tommy helped with the cattle in the distance, he reflected on the strange chain of events that had brought them together. $50 spent at an auction in Pine Ridge had purchased not just Clara's freedom but his family's redemption from grief and isolation. The giant cowboy had commanded the frightened woman to trust in his protection, and she had given him something infinitely more valuable in return: the strength that came from love freely given and received. Together they had proven that some foundations were strong enough to withstand any storm, some bonds deep enough to overcome any challenge. As Thunder Peak stood sentinel over their valley, Jacob Stone knew with absolute certainty that he had found something worth more than gold, more precious than land, more enduring than the mountains themselves. He had found a family forged in fire and tempered by adversity, strong as the peaks that watched over them and unshakable as the bedrock beneath their feet. The frightened woman was frightened no more, and the lonely cowboy had learned that true strength came not from standing alone against the world, but from standing together with those who chose to share both burdens and blessings. In the end, that was worth any price, any risk, any sacrifice required to protect it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.